Thank you very much and welcome everyone. Good afternoon if you're here in the UK. Good morning if you're in North America. Good evening if you're in Asia. Thank you very much for joining us today for what will be a very, very interesting and exciting seminar. We're very happy today to welcome Andrew Cainey, who is a founding director of the UK National Committee on China, and also a fellow of the Royal United Services Institute in London. He's the co-author most recently of a book out this year called Xiconomics, What China's Dual Circulation Strategy Means for Global Business. I think he's going to talk a bit about the book today and also some broader issues in the Chinese economy. So thank you very much for coming to join us today, Andrew, and please take it away.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for inviting me to come and talk today, and thanks to all of you for joining on such a wonderful day. I can see on my own screen the sun is moving itself across my head, but I'm here to talk a bit about the Chinese economy based on what we've written in our book, and I'm planning to focus mainly on the domestic economy, though the book also covers a lot of things about China's role in the world and the implications of all of this for multinational business that's seeking to do business with China, and please feel free to pick up any of those points in the Q&A. What I'm now going to try and do is share my screen with you and talk about Xiconomics. So I wanted to start by a few pictures about China's economy today, because this really starts to encapsulate some of the extremities. On the left-hand side, we have Country Garden, China Evergrande, massive property development companies, big real estate crisis in China right now, and a lot of discussion about, is this the now collapse of the Chinese economy, which I don't believe. Is it certainly a difficult time economically, which I do believe. And then on the right-hand side, companies like BYD that are now outperforming and larger than Tesla in EVs, and CATL, the Chinese battery company, the world's largest battery company, that's really at the forefront of a lot of technology development. And indeed, as one even looks at the Chinese economy today, we see what's happening in the real estate sector taking a lot of growth away from GDP, having a negative headwind of 2 or 3 percentage points, but then really strong growth in about 20% of the economy, the technology side of the economy, in EV, in renewables, in AI, those aspects. And so China's always been a lot like this, very, very mixed, a lot of extremes within it. Again, on context, we talk about what is the economy. And I remember talking probably 10 years ago to some people in government about economic policy making in China and saying it isn't inherently, the politics are very, very strong indeed. And so as we talk about China's economy and in the title of our book, the role of Xi Jinping very much comes to the fore. There's been a much stronger role now for ideology and for security in the management of China's economy. But I put the picture on the right-hand side, which dates from before Xi Jinping. It's in Shanghai, and it is this juxtaposition of Gucci, of China as the world's largest luxury designer goods market, together with the slogans of the Chinese Communist Party. So maybe this has all come to the fore much more in the past few years, and we recognize it, but it's certainly been there in the background before. And as we talk about the state of China's economy and the changes underway, and there are some very real changes, I will take the famous quote from 2007 of Wen Jiabao that China's growth is unstable, unbalanced, uncoordinated. Got two unstables there, only one unstable, I think. But it's really was diagnosed, 15, 16 years ago as having a set of problems, heavy in real estate, lots of debt finance. And what's happened since? Well, we have an economy that, despite all these challenges, is now 3 times larger. The development of the high-speed rail network, the strength in technology, rise in share of global manufacturing from 10% to 30% over that time horizon. And the sudden emergence of China this year as the world's leading exporter of passenger vehicles based on its strength in electric vehicles. So there's been a lot of progress and development, and yet the challenges are still there. That's not to say they don't matter. It's just to say that a lot of these challenges have been around a long time, maybe getting worse year by year, but somehow China continues to find a way through this. So I turn now to Xiconomics, and Xiconomics is the word we landed on, having written a book on dual circulation strategy, which I'll talk a bit about in a moment in some more detail. And what is striking to us about the word is we liked it to describe the way in which Xi Jinping and his overall centralized leadership defines so much about the development of the Chinese economy. But what was then striking to us as we started doing some research and looking on Google is that Xiconomics is actually an English word blessed by the Chinese Communist Party and by Chinese state media. So you see this first quote at the top, Xiconomics, the one word set to define China's long-term growth agenda, is from 2017, just after the 19th Party Congress, and that Global Times and Xinhua continue to use this phrase in their English language publications to this day to talk about Xi Jinping's economic philosophy. And indeed, back in, I think it was summer of 2022, the party issued a several hundred-page guideline on Xi Jinping economic thought that people, party cadres, needed to read to understand how to apply this approach to their economic decision-making. And so this word Xiconomics, which sounds like Reaganomics or Abenomics, et cetera, is a word that the Chinese side have embraced as well, in line with many of these words that get used in the Chinese policy landscape. We'll talk about others like common prosperity or high quality development. In common with those, this is actually quite a vague term as defined by the Chinese state, and we need to add some of our own precision to it, which is what we've tried to do on this page. So what is Xiconomics? Well, in Chinese, there's no exact Chinese translation of what is Xiconomics. It is Xi Jinping economic thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. And we drew out really 9 aspects about what is Xiconomics. The first, obviously, is that it is Xiconomics. It's very personalized, in line with the nature of Xi Jinping's leadership. Whereas previously, the premier under, say, a Wen Jiabao would be more involved in the economic side of things. That is not the case with Xi. And indeed, just as Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang came into power, The Economist was talking about what will Leaconomics be like? And the answer, of course, was there was no Leaconomics, it was Xiconomics. And now we have the second Li Qiang as premier. We also still don't have Leaconomics. Secondly, as has been restated under Xi Jinping, the party, the Communist Party, leads everything. North, South, East, West, leads everything. And Xi unambiguously leads the party. Again, Xiconomics. Thirdly, if we pick out the words from the Chinese media, Xiconomics is holistic, it's all-embracing, and we'll get to what that means in a moment. There's a focus on high-quality growth, which is, again, around the sense that growth at all costs is not what's needed anymore. We need to look more broadly at quality of life, at environment, things like that, at sustainability in all senses. Though also note that high quality can sometimes be a euphemism for being low. It's okay that we've got lower growth because it's high quality. That it's human-centered, it's based on what people need. But you know, my own sort of reaction to those 3 words is therefore very ambiguous. What does that actually mean? Now it's put into practice through dual circulation strategy, and I'll come back to that in a moment because that's a big element of what I'd like to talk about today. But it is also based on Xi Jinping announcing in 2017 a new principal contradiction. So this is the articulation of the opposing forces in Chinese society using a Marxist analytical approach, that effectively is what is the main organizing challenge we are facing? What is it we need to work on to drive Chinese society forward? And until Xi Jinping, this was very much around a statement of raising the standards of living, GDP growth. Now there's a new principal contradiction, which is about balancing, reconciling the unbalanced and inadequate nature of development, the economic growth, together with ever-growing needs for a better life, which talks then about issues again, such as environment, such as justice, rule of the law, and has been captured also in this phrase common prosperity, which is another ambiguous phrase, but essentially gets to some form of addressing inequalities in society, the urban-rural distinction, the wealthy-poor distinction. How can we work on that? But of course, what that means is part of the ambiguity within Xiconomics, which, as I'll come to, is part of what's causing a lot of the problems now. The point about comprehensive security is Xi Jinping, alongside the economy, has advanced this comprehensive national security concept with something like 16 different types of security, not just military, not just police, but financial security, cultural security, environmental security. And so what we are really seeing in a lot of discussion about the economy these days is what are the security concerns and how do we address those? Completely intertwined with economics and intertwined at the same time with ideology and the role of the party. So this is now, as you were seeing, a bit amorphous. The ambiguity is coming forward. Now, nonetheless, a lot of the discussions are what I call here the same old, same old. What is the role of the market? What is the role of the state? What is the role of reform and opening up? And in the discourse and in the policy announcements, you'll see still very strong commitment to reform and opening. It just may mean something different. And there are questions about the credibility, but the phrase is still there. Issues about raising domestic consumption, innovation, been there a long time. And for the final two, a big focus on the role of technology, on urbanization, smart cities, data. Data as a resource, factor of production, alongside labor and capital, stronger role for the party state, and finally, in line with Chinese policy and ideology in general, this is a lot about principles, and then how does one apply those principles in practice on the ground, rather than some economic theoretical framework in the way of a neoclassical free market economics. So Xiconomics is intensely principle-driven, ideology-driven, and amorphous with the study guides, which one then interprets, and at its best is pragmatic. One of the questions around is how pragmatic is China these days? After that somewhat long discussion of Xiconomics, I did want to show this short graphic, which Gaithkal put together, looking at the numbers of times phrases were used in party congress reports. And what one sees here between 2007 and 2022 is a strong increase in the mention of security, a big increase in the mentions of science and technology, and fewer uses of economy and reform. Now, there is a twist here that the use of the word development has gone up. So economic development is still very much on the agenda. But one can see here that the priorities around security and science have really come up in relation to various market-oriented messages. Let me talk a bit about dual circulation strategy against that backdrop, because in a sense, this increasingly ideological and security-driven approach reinforces the need for this and the value of this dual circulation strategy framework. So what is it? Very simply, it's a way of looking at the world and says we have our internal circulation, the flow of economic activity at home in China, and we have the external circulation, which is the rest of the world. And rather than saying we're all integrated into one global economy and it's seamless and it's borderless, we're going to draw the clear dividing line. We're going to split things into two, between the internal and the external. And then we, China, are going to seek mutual reinforcement. that the economy of the rest of the world should help us in China, and then we should use internal circulation to work into the rest of the world. And that is quite a change. It's very simple, but it is a change from seamlessness. Going back to the mid-80s, China was saying, what we're going to do is join into the great international circulation. Xi Jinping has said, we're no longer going to put both ends of our production into the world, that we are sourcing stuff from the rest of the world, we bring it into China, do a little bit to it, and then send it back out. So both of those framings are around, there's the world and China's not that distinct, or China's quite small. And now what we're saying with internal circulation and external circulation is China's become a lot larger as an economy, and it's very distinct. And we need to be aware of that dividing line and how we manage it. Now, this framing of circulation to understand the economy, and one of the reasons we conclude it's not just our buzzword, is the intellectual heritage that one can show for this phrasing, back to the wealth of nations, to Das Kapital, or the circulation of capital, to Keynes's general theory, and the fact that Justin Lin, who a leading Chinese economist, who was chief economist of the IMF, wrote this article took the time, in a sense, to write this article and explain the academic tradition of this framing in this article in 2021, and that then Xi Jinping talks about this as a very dynamic approach. It's much more biological, it's less dry. Let's get the energy and the life flowing within the economy. I touched on the points from the past that this does mark a change from what was happening in the past. Not a complete break, as I'll come on and talk about in the adjustment, because how the choices one makes with dual circulation vary depending on the time. And one can go back, in the book, we go back through a history of showing how at times China was more isolated, more focused on domestic circulation, and then was very thoughtful in how it would draw on the rest of the world, in the words of Mao, helping, making the foreign serve China. All of which is a more general and a broader experience than the past 20 years or so, where there's been a push towards this sort of seamless integration. And Justin Lin, in his article, says that dual circulation is the response to new challenges, as well as the economic reality that China is facing, meaning several things, meaning China can't keep growing by exporting more and more to the rest of the world. Its economy is getting too big, and the domestic economy is now big enough to support more of the activity. And secondly, geopolitically, both the rest of external circulation is becoming more of the challenge in terms of protectionism, in terms of tariffs, and in terms of the ability to source technology there as well, as we've seen with US export controls. So in talking about dual circulation strategy, really we look at this at three levels. The first is this framework. The second is a set of choices, and the third is a slogan or a brand. And that last one is really the least important. That's the fact that every 6 months or so, it appears, a new phrase comes out in China which says, we need to go after common prosperity, that's everything, or we need to go after high quality development. And for a while, it was dual circulation. And what one actually finds when you look at it is a lot of that is about the policies, same old policies that have been discussed for a long time. But the other two levels are more important. I've talked about the way of framing the economic landscape, that we're not looking at a single integrated economy, we're looking at something divided. And that approach applies equally to the US, with the idea of increased onshoring or friendshoring and a reduction in interdependence with China. It applies to the EUK, even saying, let's have a clearer dividing line with the EU as a result of Brexit. So that is a framework for all time, which just says, let's think about the stuff at home, let's think about the rest of the world, and think about how they interact. And then you have a strategic choice, which is, how important is the stuff at home? How important is the rest of the world? Well, how do I want to run the stuff at home? And Xi Jinping's got a certain model of doing that, which is very different to a Western model. And then how do I get them to interconnect? So back in 2020, when dual circulation strategy was announced, Xi Jinping talked about internal circulation needs to be the mainstay. So he's making a strategic choice which says internal circulation is more important for us going forward than external circulation. Now, domestic and international need to reinforce one another, but we need to expand industrial demand. We need to have a consumption-led growth model. We need to do industrial upgrading, greater technological self-reliance, and so on. And one aspect that was very striking to me is that Liu He, when he went to Davos in 2023, repeated exactly the same words that Xi Jinping had done in 2020. So the direction, the wished-for direction of travel has remained the same. But that doesn't mean that's what actually happens. And so again, this balance of dual circulation strategy varies depending on the situation. And really what's happened since, ironically, what's happened since Xi Jinping announced in 2020 that he wanted internal to be the mainstay, is it became less important. So the internal circulation had actually become the mainstay. Exports have become much less important from about 2010 onwards to the growth of the Chinese economy. But then with COVID, domestic weakness meant that much more of China's growth came from exports. And so there was, in a sense, an adaptation, a natural reaction to domestic weakness. Second one is conceivably, I don't see it at the moment, but conceivably one can make a view where these circulations come back together again, the sort of model we had before where borders don't matter so much and there's ongoing integration. And then finally, there's this complete separation. This will be a radical decoupling of some kind. And this refers to words that Xi Jinping was using back in May or June about the need to think about extreme scenarios, apply what he called limit thinking, what might actually happen here. And a lot of this boils down to what can happen in the domestic economy. I'm not going to go into all these different aspects here. The way I think about China's economy is really in three buckets. The first is the context and the fundamentals. And there's a familiar set of issues that China faces in demographic terms, in its focus on real estate, the US tariffs, protectionism, and so on, alongside the climate challenge, the need to catch up. And that's sort of shaping what sort of environment is policy operating in. And then onto that context, the Chinese leadership say, what are we actually trying to achieve? And before it was pretty straightforward, because it was overall, we want more economic growth. And what's really complicating things now is they're trying to get everything. They want that. We'd like some economic growth. We'd also like some income redistribution. Security is really important. Self-employment is very important. By the way, we need to study Xi Jinping thought and put aside study time for that and have more party influence. And how that all comes together is very messy and ambiguous. Sometimes that can actually reinforce it. So bringing up the wealth of the poorest, say 30–50% of the population, could really help stimulate consumption, depending on how one actually did it. But at other times, if it comes across as taxation or the suppression of private enterprise, you're already going to harm private sector growth. And so given that complexity, the whole thing's become a lot messier. What matters is really execution effectiveness, and meaning execution effectiveness in a very, very broad ways. Are good policies being developed? Are they being trialed? And one of the big strengths of the Chinese economy has been learning and adaptation and adjustment and localization. And it's hard to tell, but there's a lot of evidence that that's not working very well anymore. People are following central direction out of fear, out of making a mistake, that there's not enough speaking truth to power. And so this transition to this adaptation is not really happening. And we're seeing a lot of confusion. And that's a lot behind the travails of the Chinese economy today. Whereas on the other side, internationally, Xi Jinping is out launching initiatives, trying to shape lots of things. This focus on domestic circulation is not to mean a cutting off from the world, because it foresees both Chinese companies having a stronger role in the world as they become technology leaders, China having a much stronger role shaping global governance and continuing to draw on imports, especially from the global south. So it's very integrated, and I'd be happy to talk more about the international side if interested. I'm going to sort of come to the end of the 2 or 3 pages now on the Chinese economic situation at the moment. There's a lot of discussion these days about the weakness of demand and the nature of demand in the Chinese economy. There's also a lot of discussion about excess supply, because Chinese policy reaction to most problems is to invest in further assets, be it infrastructure or production capacity. And so again and again, we do see an excess of supply capacity. But over time, what's actually needed is this interactive, dynamic balance between supply, or really the productive potential of the economy, and demand. And I'll talk through the graphics on each side. On the left-hand side, this is a breakdown of where has China's economic growth come from over the past 40 years or so. And you'll see it starts off on the left-hand side. The blue is just more people going into work. And now China's working population is falling. So that source of growth has gone away. There's a small gray sliver, which is human capital per working, which is basically the workers are getting better educated, better qualified, and there's certainly potential for that in future. But then you see the bulk of the growth, and almost all the growth in 2019 came from the orange, the physical capital per worker, increasing investment, diminishing returns. And so what the problem has been, a lot of investment in stuff which has not led to greater productive capacity in the economy. You spent the money to do the investment, it hasn't actually created the ongoing benefits. And the lighter orange color there is the critical one, the total factor productivity, that China was getting better. It was consistently growing by sort of getting more with less, becoming more productive, better institutions, better markets, better ways of putting resources together. And that's pretty much dried up. And so when we talk about a growth model for China, what China needs to do is find its own way, which will be a messy mix of state and private and party and market, but a messy mix which has higher productivity and may keep investing a lot, but investing into productive returns that meet up with what people want. And that's where we go to the demand side of the equation. What we see is there, the red again is investment. That investment has been playing a large role alongside consumption, but in recent years, particularly 2022, the main role in growth. And consumption, the consumption demand has come down because people are saving, because they have on the whole saving a lot of their household income. Household incomes may have a lower share of GDP that we could talk about. But rebalancing the demand side towards consumption means one would need to work on the investment side as well, create the demand for investments in consumer-facing activity. But you can also see there the light blue, which is the impact of trade. And you can see that trade from 2009 through to 2018 also really was not contributing much to growth. And that's now come back, and that's a challenge because of the geopolitics, because of the slowdown in the world economy. And that's what we've seen in the past month or two of the worsening of the Chinese trade figures. So I want to close by saying, overlaying these structural questions about the makeup of demand and supply is this issue of leadership and clarity. We have on the left-hand side Jack Ma, the pulling of the Ant Financial IPO, the restructuring of big tech. We have common prosperity. And one can debate lots of reasons on this, but that's a little bit the point, that people look at the Alibaba and financial situation and say, well, there's a whole argument I can make based on economics, that this was good economic regulation. There's another whole argument I can make based purely on politics and taking down a challenger to Xi Jinping, someone who'd become too popular. And no doubt, in many ways, it's a blend. And there's also a role within that for the regulators and organizational interests competing with one another. common prosperity. Xi Jinping started using this term. And the challenge is, it didn't really say what it meant. So I've got this phrase here for Alice through the looking glass. When I use a word, it means what I choose it to mean. And the question is, can many words mean so many different things? To which Humpty Dumpty says, well, you just need to be master. And then you're defining what it means. And the problem is, Xi Jinping has been talking about combating excessively high incomes. And people don't know if that means $1 million a year or $100,000 a year or $30,000 a year. And when Mao used the phrase common prosperity, it meant the nationalization of the means of production. That's not what Xi Jinping means, but people start thinking, well, hang on a minute, there is a history to each of these phrases. And there's no anchoring, there's no something which reassures me that the more extreme scenarios aren't going to come to pass. And that creates a big loss of confidence, certainly among Westerners, foreigners, but even more amongst many of Chinese business. And so on top of this issue of growth models I talked about, it strikes me that after COVID, we're trying to put Humpty back together again. There was this sort of secret sauce or this mixture in China where people were confident, private sector entrepreneurs complained a bit here and there, but also were very active at investing, growing, a lot of dynamism in the economy. That's been hit a lot, partly by COVID, or a lot by the politicization of the economy. And now the Chinese government, the NDRC, the party have started coming back, trying to reestablish credibility about how much they want the private sector to return to investing and do things. And I capture this really in this phrase, animal spirits with Chinese characteristics, as Keynes talked about the emotion and the enthusiasm, the way of the energy that drives an economy, and that very similar to this idea of circulation. And it's essentially that Xi Jinping is saying, I want that back, but it has to be within the confines, within the guidelines of party ideology. Now, even back in 2018, I remember actually seeing Jack Ma talk in Tianjin about how much they look to Xi Jinping for leadership, and clearly this phraseology around being consonant with the party was there even then. But it's can we square this circle with credibility, which I think we can in some areas, in some policy priorities, in others less so. And I did see a piece of work for the National University of Singapore earlier this week, analyzing government pronouncements on the private sector and showing again how the use of the word market and so on has gone down, and the use of the word party has gone up quite distinctively. So what you're trying to put together is find some new mix, and we're quite away from that at the moment, I think, from establishing the credibility. Finally, and just touch on this, what does that mean for multinationals in China? And there's a lot of reports, for the most part, saying, hey, everybody's leaving China, or at least we stopped investing in China. And certainly there is a big move away, and we can talk about that if people are interested, particularly around sourcing and logistics. But just looking at this about 6 months ago, I was struck by the diversity. You've got Starbucks deeply committed to further growth, even though they're facing a lot of Chinese competition at a time where Gap sold out. You've got Honda, striking deals in China, just at the same time as they're looking at how they can decouple their parts supply globally. And unfortunately, I think BMW, at a time when many people are relocating out of China, BMW moving EV production into China away from the UK. So as always with China, lots of diversity, many different aspects we can see. And I hope that's given a flavor of different aspects. And I welcome questions and reactions on that.
Great. Thank you very much for an excellent presentation. The floor is open, by the way, for questions. Let me just remind everyone in the audience, if you have a question, please click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen to submit the question in writing, and then we'll pose the questions to Andrew as those are received. Before we're still waiting for some audience questions, I have a couple questions for you myself. The first is really just a point of clarification. So at a couple points in the slides and in the talk, you mentioned this idea of putting both ends or both heads out in the world. I assume that means to the sort of higher value added upstream and downstream parts of production. Is that right?
So that was more Xi Jinping saying, what we don't want to keep doing this. That what we've done in
Right.
the past is we've brought in raw materials or semi-finished products. We've done the standard processing trade, and then we've immediately sold it out again. And we want to stop doing that. We want to have more of the production at home and more of the sales at home.
Right, but also I'd imagine more of the actual tech and innovation as well as more of the branding and sort of markup at
Absolutely.
home, right? So that's, yeah.
Very much around brand, around technology, and as I touched on slightly, we China can still then send the lower value added stuff overseas, and we China are not uncomfortable with textiles leaving China and going elsewhere, or making shoes in Ethiopia. That's fine. What we want to do in China is create companies like a Haier or a Huawei or a BYD that have the brand and then are at the head of value chains, which are still regionally distributed. But we have the power in a sense, which is no longer the Westerners or the Japanese coming to China for bits of the process.
Right, absolutely. The other question I have for you is broader, which is that, several times in the talk you alluded to sort of Keynesian concepts of how to salvage an economy when it's in crisis, how to rescue a moribund economy where aggregate demand has dipped too low. But looking at things from sort of the flip side, because I'm sure you recall around the time of the 2008 economic crisis and actually all the way back to the Great Depression era, there was this big debate between the Keynesians and anti-Keynesians. And some other people would say that excessive bad investment during the boom was really responsible for the bust, and there's no way to get out of it except by unwinding all of that high investment. And I think a lot of people looking at China in the recent past have said, well, investment and debt are both too big and too unproductive.
Yeah.
Right? There's too much unserviceable debt or non-performing debt, and then there's also just too much bad investment that isn't really producing much of a return. And you sort of alluded to that as well. So do you think that this could be, on balance, the bigger issue, that there isn't really a Keynesian path out, but maybe we just have to have a kind of slow monetarist unwinding of the excessive investment that's been there for so long?
I think in many ways, yes. So I think that the fundamental problem in the Chinese economy is a big focus, a big share of the investment that has been unproductive. So one can have a share of the investment which is high and is productive, and that would be a great thing. It would build the productive potential of the economy, lead to higher living standards, and so on. But that's not what's happened. And those symptoms, those issues were there even when Wen Jiabao was talking about it in 2007, but they became a lot stronger, and particularly the scale of the response to the global financial crisis that held up Chinese growth. And that is a real issue. Now, how do you get out of that? There isn't an easy way to get out of that. Over time, so I don't think it's about Keynesian stimulus to the economy. I think it is about accepting a lower growth rate. I think there are things one can do economically, but mainly can't be done politically in China around assigning ownership rights to state-owned enterprises to pension funds, for example, so that there's a better savings safety net within China. So that from a political perspective, Xi Jinping is in a very tough spot. It feels more like what he's saying is we need to keep going on the high-end technology reliance, and there's a lot of money for that, and those parts of the economy will keep growing, and I imagine will be quite successful. We need to steadily address the issue of real estate and bad investment, and in a sense sort of hope that consumption comes through. Now there's some stuff that a lot of what they do on the consumption side is quite small, and they have the party has a sort of disdain for giving something too much directly to the consumers, and they could practically economically tilt that balance somewhat. But I think the other thing is there's a good article written by, I think it was Adam Tooze wrote it, about the mix of what's happening here. A a lot of this is a conscious policy of the government, so that when the three red lines came in to help manage the exposure in the real estate sector, and say, we've got a problem here, we need to manage it down. One could try, I wouldn't recommend it, one could try and keep running the real estate boom for a while and see how it blows up ultimately. This is the government saying, we can't crash everything completely, but we need to try and manage this down in some way. And so in a sense, it's a bit within the control of the government, not completely, but a bit within control of the leadership, how much to do that.
Great, thank you very much. We do have now some questions that have come in from the audience, so I'll give you some of those. The first question asks, and this actually harps on this idea of Leaconomics, and I actually wonder if Leaconomics and Winconomics didn't exist as English terms because they evoke imagery that maybe isn't what the Chinese government would prefer.
Yes.
But yeah, aside from just the personalistic leadership of Xiconomics, but did Xiconomics replace Leaconomics, for example, the 60-point plan, gradually over time, or was it always there after Xi came to power in 2012?
Not sure is the answer to that. I mean, there was a lot of ecstatic, warm reaction to the initial statements, right, when she came to power, and the market's the decisive factor, and so on. But all along there, when you go back and look at it, the leading role of the state-owned enterprises was still there. I would say more a Leaconomics, well, maybe it got expressed, though I think that was actually she was involved all along. Actually, so a couple of things, I think. There is, what is Xiconomics and who was driving it? I think she was always driving it. I think what has happened over time is the security and the ideology piece have become stronger and more prominent within that. And so Xiconomics has evolved rather than it being Leaconomics from the start.
And then related to that, how does the Belt and Road Initiative relate to Xiconomics?
Well, that's a lot around the engagement with the rest of the world. There is an economic rationale around reshaping connectivity in the world economy, so that trade routes, investment flows center more around Beijing or around China, and on Chinese terms, hence the sort of the Belt and Road courts that were being put in place, things like that, policy coordination, there's a lot of stuff beyond the actual infrastructure projects. And so it fits to that. There's an element around the usage of excess capacity in state-owned enterprises. I don't think that's definitive. I do think it is, to this point, you were just touching on a moment, Bill, about the Chinese companies getting the brand and the leadership, and the Belt and Road countries not. And so you look at Pakistan, you look at Ethiopia, there are whole plans around processing zones there where those economies can upgrade because they're at a lower economic level than China, but they do it by taking on the China role of processing, while it's Chinese companies that are steering the terms of the engagement, the terms of the debate. And so it's actually quite a large part of the international element of Xiconomics.
Now I've got a set of 3 related questions from one questioner that are kind of framed as little questions, but they're actually quite big questions. So I'll give you all 3 of them and see what you can do with them. Yeah. It says, what is the role of U.S. apparent determination to curtail Chinese growth? Question 1. Question 2, to what extent is dual circulation motivated by distrust of the U.S., allowing China to keep growing? Or by China's distrust of the U.S. that the U.S. would allow it to keep growing. And 3rd, what is the difference between Chinese dual circulation thinking and Western decoupling?
Yeah, very good questions. So I think that they're very strongly linked together, but I wouldn't put the U.S. as sort of the determinative factor in what's been happening. I mean, firstly, I have a chapter in the book on this, the roots of dual circulation, saying, hey, China is now more important, we want more domestic consumption, we want technology leadership, all those things. They've been around for a long time. You go back to indigenous innovation, I think it was 2008, 7, and then Made in China 2025, announced back in 2015. There's Plus, as I would say, this is just a sensible thing that countries do. How do countries get rich? They get better and better at doing stuff, and they have their own technology. They create great companies like Korea or Japan, and their people get the rewards in the shape of higher consumption levels and standards of living. And so that part of it has been consistent. But the framing in 2020 and the emphasis, as I said, this switch from the integration to the separation in the framing, I think was very shaped by what happened with Huawei and ZTE back in 2016, 2017, 2018. Alongside a sort of Xi Jinping saying, well, China's going to be China. We certainly aren't becoming China with Western characteristics. The role of the part is back, and that takes you back to 2017. So I just think all this stuff got a lot sharper over time, and becomes then, to some of the other questions being asked, the best organizing framework for thinking about the problem is that if I'm running China, then I think about the rest of the world. Is it helping or harming me? What sort of interaction do I want with the rest of the world? What sort of interaction is the rest of the world willing to have with me, i.e. US has cut off advanced semiconductors? And how do I prepare for it? And there's these quotes about limit thinking, extreme scenarios, is saying, well, I better be ready to be more self-reliant. And I think I got the last question, the final question. I think there are a lot of similarities with the American approach or the European approach, desire for strategic autonomy. I did give a presentation to some Chinese business people on dual circulation with Western characteristics. And so this mirroring across, if you look at the list of, and this is not really surprising, but look at the list of the sensitive priority technologies, they're the same in China as they are in the US. Surprise, surprise. And, guess what? The US wants to lead in them, and China does, and Japan has a list of technologies. And so they're all looking at this. Now, of course, the role of consumption is a bit different in the US. But there is a lot more of this, or in simple terms, just nationalist thinking, right? The thing, I need to look after my own interests as a country. And the question is, how does the rest of the world economy support me or hinder me in that? And how do I do that? And it actually takes me back to a phrase of Tony Blair's, which I disagreed with. Tony Blair was saying at one point, globalization is this unstoppable trend. We need to adapt to it. Of course, what that missed was someone saying, hang on a minute, we don't need to just surrender to these impersonal global forces. There are these strong global forces around, and they bring benefits and they bring disadvantages, but there is a role for political leadership into how do I shape those. And we see that very clearly in China, but we're seeing it in other countries as well.
Great. That's a very cogent, clear, and concise answer to three very big questions. I'm quite impressed. A few more questions now from the audience. One is, what is the implication of China's change in approach, as well as explained in the presentation, that is looking inward? What's the implication of this for Europe's strategic independence in key clean energy technologies, particularly in view of China's investment in European strategic assets?
Yes, yeah. I think it's back to the articulation I gave it just a moment ago. It starts with Europe saying, where are our risks, where are our dependencies? And I framed this recently around the UK. So the UK strategy at the moment, and the European strategy, would be, we need to talk to China about climate. We need to engage with China on climate and see how we can cooperate. And that takes us to renewables, and that takes us to solar panels, and that takes us to Xinjiang, and it takes us to potential coercive diplomacy or withholding of that. And so it is engagement on those aspects of climate, right? Or are we just trying to talk about limit targets rather for net zero or something? I think you really need to look at it. And it's the same issue with batteries at the moment. There's a big, it's been very much in the news the past week or two. You have the set of subsidies coming out of China, which destroys the economics of other companies profitably making them. It of course means we have very cheap solar panels, very cheap batteries. But it says, how do we try and create our own capability there and where do we look at what the real choke points are. So there's the manufacturing choke point, there's the rare earth access choke point on different aspects of the value chain. How do we develop rare earths? Now, how much the EU should do that, or Europe should do that, and how much Europe and the US, or indeed then you add in, Japan, Korea, etc., can do that, I think is a very worthwhile discussion, and an area where, so Larry Summers saying, it's crazy to argue that the US should become self-reliant in everything that we belong to. We say Pennsylvania should become self-reliant in sort of PPE equipment or something like that. And it just either it doesn't work for the UK, it doesn't really work for Europe, it may just about work for the US in some things, but all of this has an economic cost, and we need to try and find a way of diversifying that between in this phrase like-minded countries. People essentially who we trust are not going to withhold stuff from us. Now, I would also, though, caution, we look at this dependence, it is a dependence, we need to be clear what sort of dependence we're talking about and how real it is, and et cetera, et cetera. What I mean by that is there is a case one might argue is we don't want to get our solar panels from China because they're made by, or some of them are made by forced labor in Xinjiang, and ethically we don't want to do that. And that's completely legitimate, we make that decision. China has not really, very few examples of them withholding exports. There's discussion about rare earths with Japan years ago, and that was also seen to be probably not the case. And so actually, China likes to keep selling stuff. They could change, obviously it could change. And if something happened more extreme like Taiwan, then you need to think about, so what sort of risk are we talking about versus the challenges that Lithuania, Australia, others have had, Korea, in their exports to China, where again, China has said, we're going to block the stuff that we don't need very much, but we're going to keep taking the stuff from Australia, the iron ore, that we do need. But overall, a reassessment of knowing what dependence or exposure there is, looking to diversify, looking to bring onshore, and recognizing there's probably some cost to that is something that makes sense.
Great. One other question specifically about sort of UK and European responses to some of this, which is very direct and a bit narrower than these very broad ones that we've been talking about just now. Should the UK be inviting China to the AI Safety Summit in November?
I think I think a one-word answer to that, which is yes. The more complicated answer is, well, it depends on the agenda and the ambitions. And so one can imagine, I think it's actually maybe what's being proposed, is that you have 2 sessions or 2 sub-meetings, because there are a bunch of things where everyone would really like, we in the West, or I, would like a global regulation of AI. There are issues issues in the military sphere, but issues potentially around other standards where we would like to see if we can get to a common understanding with China at a global level. There are questions around what's China's stance on that? Is it enforceable? All those things. But I think it would make sense to try. There are other things where it's in a sense less necessary because you've got a separate technology ecosystem in China, and it's also less likely in that China is it comes back to this discussion there always is, what is AI? In a sense, these days everything's AI. But if you look at facial recognition of Uyghurs in Xinjiang, then that is AI. China's very advanced in that. Is China going to agree to a same set of controls on that we in the UK would want to have? I just can't see how they would. Is it even worth having the discussion on that, rather than recognizing that we have different standards in our society, that we want to get the right standards for sort of liberal democracies for ourselves, and we could well reach agreement with fellow Europeans and with the Americans on that. It's unlikely we're going to reach agreement with China or that they would follow it. And so I don't think we should give up on our engagement with China on AI. It's very important that we do it, but we need to be realistic, and we need to have other discussions which are more, what do we want? What are our bottom lines on this?
Great. Here's another focused question from the audience about sort of developing world engagement rather than UK Europe. I asked before about the BRI. Actually, from the audience, I had a question about that. Here's another sort of going beyond that, which says, what about China's engagement with the global South more broadly? For example, in the recent expansion of the BRICS club, how does this fit into the wider Xiconomics model?
So let me start with the sort of broader Xiconomics model, which would be, we want to be engaged with the rest of the world, we China, and as much as possible, we want to do it on our terms. Now, we recognize that we China recognizes there is a setup in the world already, some of which works really well and has worked to our advantage. We're not going to reinvent everything, but we would like to shape and influence it as much as we can in line with what we'd like. And that talks to, we talk in the book about technology standards, about the de-dollarization approach, and the desire to keep very integrated into trade. Hence, RCEP, the Asian Trade Agreement, hence China applying to CPTPP, the other more integrated Asian Trade Agreement, and hence the Global South, saying we China can be the natural leader of the Global South, and we can put some development assistance in, we can put some investments in, we can articulate together a different view of multilateralism. So both Xi Jinping and Biden say, we are committed to multilateralism. But China's narrative is that the West's multilateralism is just, G7 or Bretton Woods institutions, and we China stand behind the UN. So we have a voice, everybody in the Global South. And then we China are working with other, in their view, like-minded countries, maybe more authoritarian countries, lesser human rights, to say, change the definition of human rights in the United Nations and say that economic development is the first human right, and that human rights are for the discretion or the decision of the individual country governments rather than something universal. And so China is pushing there economically, but also seeking, to shape the world. It's a place to export, a place to import, invest. And BRICS is one such example of saying, let's get a group of people together, and from China's perspective, make it as big as we can, of people who have this different view and partly just want, each to be able to do things their own way. I mean, they're very, very different countries. But China's view of the internet, cyber sovereignty, is basically, we in China should be able to decide what we want to do in China. And Russia has the same view, and Iran has the same view. Whereas there is a US/European approach, there should be a single view, and it should be, free and open internet sort of stuff. So they're putting effort into that. The question is, as always, sort of supply and demand. It's sort of, well, that's what China wants. How appealing is that, either to individual country leaders or to individual countries? And for some, it's very appealing. For many, it's appealing to have an alternative, that it's not just the US and not just the West coming. And you see some caution. So you see, Jokowi, Indonesia, saying, well, we'll have a think about this BRICS thing. We're not so sure. Or India saying, hey, we can sort of lead the Global South too, and we're going to go to G20 and talk about the Global South agenda there. So it's not uncontested.
Great. I have one last audience question for you, and then I have a kind of final question after that, sort of drawing back into the big picture. So the audience question asks, to what extent is the current economic slowdown post-cyclical, that is post-pandemic, versus structural, for example, a middle income trap? Is Xiconomics more of a cause or more of a solution of China's current economic travails?
Right. So there is an element which is coming out of COVID, which is the way in which people's confidence has been really hit, that there was essentially no furlough scheme during the lockdowns that happened in China. A lot of small businesses went bankrupt or had problems. It brought home to many individuals, particularly in Shanghai, but the wealthier middle classes who felt, hey, I'm all right, and this China's working for me, I've got a pretty good life. Suddenly they saw the somewhat arbitrary or very arbitrary nature of lockdown and struggle to get food. And so all this stuff takes you a bit away from consumption and building up reserves. And it's partly because I think it is actually more that the tech crackdown, the growing ideology has made private sector entrepreneurs say, hang on a minute, I'm a bit, a bit cautious about this. So I am, very short term, as it were. I think a lot of the gloom right now is overdone, because I think there's a few numbers are coming out. Suddenly everybody's again saying, gosh, China's collapsing. It's not collapsing. It's got a very weak economy. As happens in any sort of business cycle, confidence returns and growth will come back. But it doesn't overcome all these other growth challenges we touched on, particularly around the demographics and the wasteful, unproductive investment and the real estate bubble. And those were challenges before, and they're challenges still. And it's just all become a lot more complicated. And I think Xiconomics there has been part of the cause, because it's become so ambiguous. It's talked about common prosperity and then gone and raided tech companies, which you can argue, and I'd actually support some of the moves they made, but it's all done in a way that, forget about the Westerners like me trying to make sense of this. The Chinese people in China are saying, what's going on here? How do I decide? How do I minimize my risk? This whole question right now of the sort of, well, how much does China want foreign business versus they go into some consulting companies and say you're breaking some security act, and then the Chinese leadership comes and says, we're going to reassure you that we really do want you. And I sort of think they do. But hell, if I'm sitting in China and I make the wrong call, the downside risk to me of being wrong is pretty bad. I'm Chinese, and so there's a 1% chance I'm wrong, but that 1% is really, really painful. So there's a lot of caution around, and I think that is a lot of the problem.
That's really a great explanation. I think the last question I have for you is actually kind of related to that, and it goes back one of your last slides, which I thought was a really nice illustration of these three possible scenarios. Right, that it's an adaptation to domestic weakness, that it could go back into sort of rejoining the global economy fully in the seamless integration, or we could have the limit thinking kind of decoupling in the extreme. And I mean, what occurred to me when you were talking through that slide, and then also during the question and answer just now, is that it doesn't seem like China could afford, at least in the short to medium term, either to re-enter the global economy in the same kind of seamless way, or to decouple completely in the limit thinking sort of way, right? And so if we think that the model of Chinese economic growth driven by investment and exports kind of comes to an end of being really effective with the 2008-2009 economic crisis, and then COVID has really slashed away at the domestic consumption side. It seems like in the short term, that top line first scenario of adaptation to domestic economic weakness has to work in order for China to succeed. But then in the longer term, the medium to longer term, there has to be a balance between these two circulations, and it has to work as a kind of co-equal basis, or else China would be really structurally unbalanced in a scenario from which it would have a hard time recovering. Is that an accurate read? And if so, is there a viable path to that end? I mean, what would that look like? What kind of specific policies would China have to follow in order to get there?
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I mean, I don't think the radical decoupling is something what they want or think is at all sustainable. And equally, I can't see how one gets back to where we were 5, 6, 7 years ago, again from the Chinese side or from the Western side. And so one's left with this sort of mixed scenario, which I think is going to be there, of some connectivity, lots of suspicion, both sides de-risking, and in one of the other phrases one uses. I would say, I mean, to apply the same sort of conceptual framing, which we do at one point, back to Belt and Road, is in a sense what you want to do, if you're China or indeed you're the West, is you want external circulation to be, like, again, external circulation on your terms. And so they would like, you could get to a situation where some of the Belt and Road countries are in a sense part of almost quasi internal circulation, or you're breaking internal circulation into two. And I don't want to go too far down this road of one world, two systems and all the rest. But there was a striking chart recently, I think that the FT reproduced it, and it's not, data may not be 100% accurate, but showing the exports to the Belt and Road countries surpassing the exports to the G7 countries. And that, I think it came off Chinese media initially. It's not quite there, but certainly exports to Belt and Road countries have grown a lot, or exports to the global south have grown a lot. And so I think that's one route on the international side. Equally, another thing that really strikes me is the when people talk to colleagues I know talk to Chinese companies in China, what's their number one thing? It's internationalization. And so they're all looking to go out and internationalize and go overseas. And I think that is an impetus for growth. Now that then takes us back to the domestic economy, where it's just not as pretty, because I think the policies in many ways are, on the problems, they're more of the same, which is keep trying to deflate real estate, restructure without big bankruptcies, going and look at financial stability. And on the consumption side, I guess some subsidies giving, they're not going to give checks to people. That's why I'm sort of holding back from saying that. It's in a sense, it's trying to find actions that they're announcing at the moment on the private sector. How do you credibly restore confidence in the private sector? Which I think they can do over time. Because if one's living in China, the party has always been around. Government relations have always been around. And yes, it's become more intrusive. Yes, it's there's been more uncertainty and etc. A lot more concern. This study time stuff now. These Chinese state bankers having to sit down and study Xi Jinping thought more. There are drags that were not there before. At the same time, people are still making money in China. There's a big thing on at the moment, the sort of Mao Tai coffee that's going out and booming, and so the Starbucks competitors are they're doing okay. The EV companies have got some problems right now because again they put too much capacity in, but there are people just will go ahead and make money and they'll get used to stuff. But I think it's a fairly slow move out of it. I don't think there's any one policy that can be announced that really snaps this into a much more positive light.
Great. Well, thank you, Andrew, very much for a fantastic presentation, and also for a really thorough and, in my view, quite interesting conversation. One of the best conversations I can recall having about the Chinese economy and its current state in quite some time. And to those in the audience, thank you very much for joining us. Do please follow the center on social media and look at our website for news of upcoming events if you enjoyed this one. And also, particularly if you enjoyed this event, do check out Andrew's excellent book, Xiconomics, What China's Dual Circulation Strategy Means for Global Business, out this past April from Agenda Publishing, and I assume available everywhere. So thank you again very much, and good day.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks, Phil.
Bye.